Chennai's big. It's also known as Madras. So if you hear, those are both famous names, and they're both the same city. Chennai was there for 5.5 months, and it is in the state of Tamil Nadu, so everyone there spoke Tamil as their first language. We have the Book of Mormon in Tamil. So Chennai was the most humid city I served in. Incredibly humid, probably 99% humidity. And it was also very hot. It was over 100 degrees. And so it was rough. The transportation in Chennai was also, that was probably the craziest transportation place. So in every city in India, we'd take buses and auto rickshaws to get around. And in 2 cities, we had bicycles that the missionaries just had there. But nowhere else was authorized for bicycles. And so in Chennai, the buses were sometimes so full. These buses are made for probably 60 people to sit down, and then maybe another like 15 to be standing and holding up on the bar. In Chennai, I mean, so maybe like 75 people are supposed to be on these buses. In Chennai, there were buses that had at least 200 people on them sometimes. And you're all packed in there. And so the way it would work with buses, and this was in every city in the mission, not just Chennai, but a lot of the times the buses won't stop at the bus stops. And so you've just got to run after it. And there's usually people all the way out the door, and people, like, you get like one toe on the step and you're hanging on to other people, and that's how you're staying in the bus. And so we'd have to run, and you jump up and you grab the bar, and you get like one toe, and it's fine. That's fine, because you're like hanging out the bus, but sometimes it was so full, there were like 200 people on it, that you had to like hang on to another person. And that's when you're a little scarier, because then you're completely dependent on that person being able to hold on to whatever they're holding on to. And that could be a couple people deep sometimes. And in Chennai, there were times where the buses were so packed that there were guys, so there's no doors in the buses, and the windows were typically down, so there's holes for the windows. And there were times where there was guys standing in the window with their arm up inside and their leg up inside all the way along the bus, just hanging out of the bus. And it was crazy. And so there's a conductor that works his way through the crowd, and he comes and collects your like 2 or 3 rupees for your bus ride. And because we were more long term, we'd usually go to the city and get a bus pass before. So all we had to do was like pull it out of our pocket and flash our bus pass at the conductor, and then he knew that we'd already paid for our monthly bus pass. But buses, and the way you get off the buses, they don't stop. They still don't stop at the stops. So a lot of new missionaries, I never did this, but there were missionaries who did. A lot of new missionaries jump off the bus, and because you have the momentum, you fall forward and you scrape up your knees and tear holes in your clothes and things like that. So what you have to do is, you're getting off the bus, they could be going like 20, 25 miles an hour. I don't know, it's pretty fast sometimes. But you get off the bus and you lean backwards as you get off, and then you jump off, and then you run, and you like, your body catches, the momentum gets you to where you don't fall over, because you were leaning backwards when you fell out of the bus. And you have to know how to do that, or else you fall on your knees and you're hurting for a while. And so that was how that typically was. If we were late to an appointment and didn't have time to wait for a bus, then we'd usually take auto rickshaws, they're a 2-stroke engine, and they have handlebars like this inside these little yellow encased things. And they're just, back in the day, they used to all go by meter, which the government set the rate for them. But none of those guys want to use the meter, because the economy, it costs more to run your thing than the government rate is. And so you usually would just argue or haggle with the auto driver. And auto drivers, if you're in a companionship that was just American, they usually just think you're a couple of foreigners, and so they want to kind of rip you off maybe a little bit, because they know they can, because tourists who come there, they just, okay, it's like $2, big deal. Well, $2 is way more than any auto ride was. I mean, an auto ride would usually be like maybe 15 cents, or But I mean, if you had foreigners come and they're like, okay, it's just $2, big deal. So auto drivers know when it's like foreign people, they can get that out of it. So why not? But we've lived there and we weren't going to pay that because we didn't really have the budget for that anyway, to be able to pay that much if you're taking all these auto rides. So you just argue with the guy for a while, and eventually you come to consensus on what you're going to pay him to go to whatever places you need to go, and then he drives you there. And we were like incredibly obedient in our missions. So our day typically started, you wake up at 6:30 and you exercise for half an hour, even if you guys are so tired that you just like pick something up and sit in the thing and lift it like this or something. We like made sure we were doing something just to be obedient, which was sometimes not really like the intention of those rules and things, to exercise for half an hour, but we always tried to be at least obedient to the letter of the law of things. And then at 7 we'd start getting ready, and so when I was in, this is a little bit of a tangent, but when I was like my first day, you start your personal study at 8. And I just went in there at like 8 o'clock, probably 8:01, 8:02. And I like had my bowl of cereal and I was sitting there like reading the Book of Mormon. And then during companionship study, my trainer was like, the rostrum, how we like turn the light off at 10:30 at night? I was like, yeah. He's like, well, that's kind of how it is with personal study. We got to like start personal study at 8 o'clock. And like usually breakfast is done before that. In that hour you have to get ready. And I was like, oh, I just had no idea. I wasn't trying to be disobedient, or I didn't even dawn on me that was a problem. And so it was like that obedient to the missionary schedule and things like that. All the guys I served with were really obedient, and that was just something I think our mission president really ingrained, is just obedience and being obedient. And we had a lot of good guys in our mission. So there was a place right across from our apartment. It was called Little Hut, but the letters on the sign weren't in English. They were Tamil. And Little Hut, that's where we'd eat a lot because it was close to our apartment. And so you could grab food and run up to your apartment and eat for lunch or for dinner. We actually didn't eat lunch most of the time in my mission. We typically just took dinner. But that place was made out of sticks. It was sticks on the sides and sticks on the roof. And they had a huge pot in the back and some pots, and they had a ton of things on their menu they make for you, but dirt floors, and that's how restaurants were a lot of the time. Other restaurants, some of them that were a little nicer, they had like floors, and it was like an open building, usually in the front with like a roll down kind of garage door. But during the day, those were up, and you go eat in there, and if you wanted water with it, there was like 4 cups, metal cups on the table always, and the same cups were used by everyone all day long. In India, you don't put your mouth on cups, and that's just the culture. And you can be, I never felt like it was really gross because people really don't put their mouths on the cups. So you hold them up above your mouth and you'd waterfall it down into your mouth. And it's kind of gross that the same cups are there all day and they're not washed or anything and everyone's using them, but at the same time, no one touched them to their mouths. So, and everyone uses their right hand to pick them up, so that's all just very normal social customs there. But yeah, we'd take auto rickshaws and buses everywhere, or we'd walk. People typically don't have cars. People drive motorcycles or take buses everywhere, and so I saw families with like 10 people on one motorcycle several times. And the law in India requires that people the driver of the motorcycle wears a helmet. So like the dad would always have a helmet on, and then his wife would be sitting like side saddle in the back, and she'd have a couple kids, and there'd be kids. None of them had helmets on. It was always just the dad, because that's what the law required, and people didn't have money to go get extra helmets. There were beaches in Chennai. I don't remember our baptismal font situation, but we had several baptisms at the beach, so maybe we just didn't have a No, we had one in our branch. Okay, Chennai. Here's a good story from Chennai. So President Bonham, I was in Chennai when President Bonham was going home, and we were getting President Nichols, and so it was President Bonham's last day. He was getting on an airplane that night, and President Nichols was coming the next day, and to be the new mission president. And we had a baptism that day that President Bonham was leaving, and we were baptizing 2 kids. One of them was 14. The girl was 14, and the guy was 18. And their mom was going to get baptized the next week, and she had signed the permission slip for her kids to get baptized. And their dad was like an illiterate drunkard who wandered around the neighborhood sometimes, but didn't know even Tamil, how to read or write Tamil, no English, hadn't really been a part of their family. Their mom was a teacher in a Catholic school. They were Catholic before. But at the baptism, the dad came in and he's just cussing and yelling at us all in Tamil, and refused to let the baptism happen, and he's just mad and angry, and so he's yelling at us. And so we called President Bonham, and I just asked President Bonham what he wanted us to do, if we should not baptize them or hold off, and it was President Bonham's last day, and so he of course was like, yeah, just baptize them. And so we baptized them both, and then their mom the next week. But we showed up to the church, my companion Elder Guntu and I. We showed up to the church the next day after their baptism for an appointment or something. We met with people at the church a lot. And there was a thing nailed to the door that we were getting sued. Elder Guntu and I, as the fathers of the church was getting sued, and we were getting sued individually. And so I have those documents still in my journal. I made copies of them and glued them into my journal. But we were inside our apartment for like a week. We couldn't do anything. We had lawyers calling us from New Delhi and from Hong Kong, because that's where the church had lawyers, I guess. And eventually those baptisms were declared as null and void by the church. They were taken off the records of the church because that's what was worked out. And so I guess their mother, even though she was Catholic, had been married to him in a Hindu marriage ceremony. And so the laws that applied were that the father, because it was a Hindu marriage ceremony, there's different laws that apply than if it had been a Christian marriage ceremony, I guess. That's just India. But their father had complete custody of the kids by rule until they were 19 and no longer considered minors in India, and at least in a Hindu marriage in India. And so Jitesh, who was the 18-year-old, he got baptized a few months later when he turned 19, and their daughter Anu, she got baptized when Josh Kadika, who I told you about, when he was serving his mission there. And so their mother and those two are still active in the church today. They stayed active for all those years, even though they hadn't been baptized, or they had been, but then hadn't been. And then they were baptized again when they could be. And so, but it's interesting because that's like, you hear, whatever is bound on earth is bound in heaven. And then whatever's loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. That's kind of an instance where they were loosed, because that's just what, I guess, the church respects the law, and that's what the law required. So daily living otherwise in Chennai, we'd be in people's homes, and people typically didn't have beds. They just had like a roll-out mat they would put on the floor. It wasn't padded or anything. It's just like reeds, like grass. It was made out of grass usually, and that's what they'd sleep on. Usually homes only had 1 or 2 rooms. There's usually a kitchen and a room. And so when we came to teach, people didn't have furniture to sit on. They'd usually roll out their bed mat. We'd all sit cross-legged on the floor and teach people. I remember there were times that we were so tired because we worked hard. But we were so tired that my companion and I would, if we were just teaching a single guy or something, we'd each sit on one side of him against the wall, cross-legged, and then I'd like sleep a little bit while my companion was teaching, and then he'd like tap me, and then he'd sleep a little bit because we were so tired and we were just working. We wouldn't take lunches usually, or we wouldn't take dinners. That's what it was, and we just worked all the time, and we were up when we needed to be, and so but we could do that because he could only look at one of us at a time if we're sitting against a wall on the floor, because it wasn't like a living room arrangement where there's chairs to kind of sit and talk. It was, you sit on the floor, and that's just how people's homes were. Bathrooms. In missionary apartments, we had Western toilets because that was one of the church's requirements for an apartment. And we usually had two, when I was there, we usually had two companionships in each apartment, because we got all those missionaries right then, so they hadn't gotten single apartments for each companionship. But we usually had a window air conditioning unit in each room, and that was like really rich in India. Like, you could look up our apartment buildings, and there was no one that had two air conditionings, and only half the places even had one air conditioning in them. And so that people thought we were really rich because we had two air conditionings. And so people would always say AC, like an AC car or an AC apartment or something, and that meant you were kind of rich. And even though we weren't really that rich, we had pretty nice apartments because I think for the church they were pretty cheap in India. And that kind of stuff was cheaper than it typically is in a lot of missions. We didn't have to pay for our apartments. That was just part of the whole deal.